Last week, we laid the off-season groundwork. This week, we're going to continue building upwards towards a winning Dynasty off-season. Let's get it. Pulling apart the fantasy football fabric one thread at a time, this is UnRavelled. I am Trav, hosting and West Coasting as is customary. We are posted up on the Undroppables YouTube channel. Please go subscribe, give us a like, leave a comment, let us know what you think. That really goes a long way. And we love seeing the interaction there on the channel. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple if you want to listen to just the audio versions. We are up and we are ready to go on those platforms. With me, as usual, is the freak in the spreadsheets. He also had a day in the sun and a big Celtics win today. He is Dan Wisner. Wiz, what's crack-a-lackin', playa?
What's going on, Trav? Yeah, I'm looking at myself here. I got a nice glow. I just gotta get it. I gotta get the red out and gotta get it browned over. But yeah, man, good day for me so far today. Nice for the Celtics to get going. But we should have some more fun than that on this episode.
Oh, we are going to have a very fun episode tonight, Wiz. We're talking about some post-draft winners and losers tonight. And it's not necessarily just winners and losers from the draft specifically. I think I came at it from a lens of more the path that some of these teams have traveled throughout the offseason that's telling us what they might want to do in 2024 with some of these players. And so not necessarily just centered around the draft, but definitely some draft flavor in here as well. We're going to be, you might get a couple buys and sells out of this episode. We're going to talk a little bit of dynasty values, dynasty rankings. And Wiz, you and I have been talking best ball the last couple of days. So I'll be honest, I have a couple of underdog ADPs in the chamber for some of these players that are really fun. And it's going to be a good one. It's going to be a really good episode. But first, Wiz, I do want to appreciate all of our loyal supporters thus far who have gone and picked up their copy of the UN Score. We have seen nothing but good reception so far. Love the questions, love the chatter that it has created in the, in the fantasy football landscape, in the Discord. Go sign up for our Patreon. Shout out. It's just been a really, really fun thing to launch. And you were definitely a lot more in those weeds than I was, but even I felt like it was a pretty good milestone as a brand to be able to launch something like that was such a finished product that had so much good work that went into it. What are you thinking about the reception so far on the UN Score?
Yeah, man, it's been really cool. I think one of the things that you mentioned was the Discord, and just hearing, some of the patrons in there just talking about, how to utilize it or their thoughts on it. Some of the feedback that we've gotten from some of the people that we, really respect, and, good feedback, as well as, things that we can take away and work towards. But yeah, man, it's been fun seeing everybody digest it here this last week or so.
Yeah, it absolutely has. And we want to keep the fun rolling here on UnRavelled, Wiz. We're going to do a little giveaway. We want to get this thing in the hands of somebody who has not had the chance to pick it up just yet. So we are going to do a giveaway of the UN Score tied to this episode of UnRavelled. So make sure you stay here, listen to the whole show, because there's going to be a nugget in this show that is your key to unlocking a copy of the UN Score for free $99. So what we're going to do, episode plays out, there will be something in this episode, and if you go to our Twitter account, we will let you know what you need to be on the lookout for. We're going to keep it open. This episode's dropping on Wednesday morning, so we're going to keep that open until Friday night. Then we'll take a look at all the people who answered correctly. We will put them in a randomizer. Maybe we'll do that on one of our next shows. Might have to rejig that, actually, Wiz, because you won't be here next week, so maybe we'll do a little off cycle, little check-in to run that or something over the weekend. But very excited to get that into somebody's hands. So keep it dialed for this whole episode, because there's going to be a little, what do they call those Easter eggs, Wiz, that we're going to have in here. And we are going to, we're going to go on a hunt, and you could win a free copy of the UN Score. So what that is our proprietary prospect model for wide receivers, gives them each of them a score within that model. The document in itself is 54 pages and 215 players deep, Wiz. So tons of goodness. And as we've always been recommending, it is but another tool in your tool belt to move towards, like we said for this show, a winning dynasty off season. So yeah, just lots of good work. Yourself, Coder, Jax, Chalk, the whole team promoting it Love
Yeah.
everything that's happening around that.
Shout out
Shout
Dukes.
out,
Shout out Dukes for all the
yeah,
artwork. Yeah.
yeah, Dukes really kind of pulled it all together and brought it to
Yeah.
life. So shout out to Dukes and shout out to Dynasty Underdog. You went on a pod just before our pod, actually, Wiz. So I just want to give that a shout out because you talked
Yeah.
a bunch about the UN score. So just another avenue for people to learn more about it. Good dudes over there on the Dynasty Underdog show as well. So just little shout out as a place where people can get some information, and appreciate them having you on to kind of talk about it from like the brand perspective, right?
Yeah, man, it was a lot of fun. Go check that out. I'll be retweeting it here from my Twitter account in a little bit, after Trav and I are done, but a lot of fun. Had a good time over there. And also, Trav, don't sell yourself short. We couldn't have done it without you either. Landing the socials for us and, working those for us. We really appreciate it.
I love it, buddy. I'm just the guy putting out tweets. And I won't acknowledge that you were late for our podcast because you were on another podcast. So
That's
fine.
fair.
It's like
I was cheating.
The other woman
Yeah.
here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Wiz. So let's get into some of these winners and losers. And because I have been yapping so much to open this show, I want to kick it to you to give me your first offseason winner thus far.
Yeah. So one of the guys that I want to talk about is Ramondre Stevenson. I'm not coming away from this saying that, this is like a massive winner by any means, but one of the things that he had to do from a value perspective and kind of an outlook here in 24, Trav, was really try and avoid, any sort of draft capital that was invested into the running back position for the Patriots. And he went ahead and avoided that, right? The Pats didn't end up going that route. They actually invested in the offensive line, invested in some of the skill positions, from a wide receiver perspective, took a guy like Jaheim Bell late. So really just had the draft focused on the offensive side of the ball. And I think, one of the things that you think about these last couple of years for the Patriots was, how much struggle we had on the offensive side of the ball and the load that he was kind of asked to carry. I think one of the things that is enticing to me is because we didn't bring anybody in from the draft perspective. We did bring in Antonio Gibson. So that is something to factor in here. And that's something that I'm keeping an eye on and will be keeping an eye on throughout camp, right? Is because one of the things that has boosted Ramondre's value is some of that, that receiving game work, right? Especially in PPR formats. He's only 1 year removed from an RB7 finish with 69 catches for just over 1,000 yards rushing on top of that, right? So we've seen him kind of have that dual kind of skill set. But I just think that, in this offense that, Alex Van Pelt's going to be bringing, it's likely going to be that run heavy approach. So if he can get up to speed and some of those man gap concepts that, Van Pelt's going to bring over from his days in Cleveland, that's going to be something to monitor here is, how fast he's picking that up throughout camp, because throughout his career, he's been better as a zone runner as opposed to a man gap runner. But again, when it comes to winners for the running back position, it's about opportunity, Trav. And I just think that Ramondre still has a nice path to opportunity.
No, I think that's really well said. And all of those kind of like paths that you laid out, or of those checkpoints for him along the path with survived free agency, survived-ish free agency. And I'll talk about that in a sec. Survive the draft. And an offensive coordinator that is going to really at least play into him getting some volume, right? And I think where I'm not that much of a believer in Antonio Gibson is that I don't think he's going to be taking on a heavy carry load, right? So I think the heavier carry load definitely is going to go to Ramondre. Don't expect this to be the super high-powered offense, right? And so maybe the goal line trips are maybe fewer and farther between, but Ramondre probably has a lock on those. I think what we kind of worry about with Gibson, of course, being a former converted wide receiver, is that he's going to take a lot of the targets. I think the good thing for Ramondre Stevenson potentially is that there might not be a huge target pie anyway. So I think what we probably want to tap into from this running back room is the rushing pie. And I think Ramondre is really the right way to go for that. So I big fan of Ramondre, got a lot of him because he was pretty well priced the last couple of seasons, and especially when he came out, got a little bit of steam, a little bit of a lull there, and then you were able to pick him up. And I think he's a solid running back too on a lot of rosters. I might have him ranked a little bit higher than consensus because I am a believer in some of the missed tackles that he can force and some of the yards after the contact stuff that he can do. Obviously, I like the pass catching for Ramondre as well, but I don't necessarily know if that's going to be there. But for a runner who's going to get a lower target share, who probably has a good chunk of that pie, I'm not a huge believer in Antonio Gibson, despite the money. So I really like Ramondre as a winner. And I know you as a Pats fan probably like that too.
Yeah. And just like, I think, especially from like a contender standpoint, right? I think, looking at some of the trades that were made the past couple of days from, Dynasty Data Lab, shout out, Adeko, he does fantastic work. But, I'm just looking at some of the ones that were made like on May 3rd. Ramondre Stevenson for Christian Watson, right? So if like you're an RB needy team and maybe you have some, wide receiver depth that people are still kind of hanging on hope to somebody like Christian Watson, like, something like that is a move that's within the realm. Another one that was made here is a 24 second and a 25 third, right? So like if you're a contending team looking for kind of cheap RB production, I think he's definitely, a solid option there because again, opportunity is king when it comes to this stuff. And at the very least, he should have that lock on the early down work. And if, to your point, Trav, it shouldn't be a high-powered offense, but if it's a little bit better than expected or these past couple of years, maybe those goal line opportunities are just a little bit, heavier as opposed to these past couple.
Yeah, and that's the intent of what they did in the draft too with Drake May and those wide receivers is to work towards becoming a more high-powered offense. Absolutely. So long term, I think that's definitely in the realm of possibilities. Wiz, I'm going to give you my first winner here, if that's okay. And it is former teammate of one Ramondre Stevenson, and that would be Mr. Ezekiel Elliott. I think why he's a winner is fairly clear. Obviously, he's going to be coming in and getting that pie. Thinking about Rico Dowdle in that backfield as well, I think you could see him as a loser and as a winner potentially because drafting a young running back would not have been great for Rico Dowdle, but I think Zeke still leaves the path to volume a little bit open for Dowdle because there could be potentially some injury. I don't know if we want Zeke taking on 250 plus carries once again, but it remains to be seen. But I think the first W for Zeke is that contract, right? And it's not necessarily just the contract he signed this year, because that one's only like total of 2 million, 1.25 on the cap or something like that. But looking at that other deal that he signed that the Cowboys got out of before he went to New England, he's still making 6 million on that. So this year from the Dallas Cowboys on two separate contracts from two separate tenures, he's making 7.25 million. Ironically, that's the exact same yearly average as what Tony Pollard just got in Tennessee. 7.25 on the button. Both tied for the, well, I guess Tony Pollard is tied for the 9th highest among running backs for average yearly salary because Zeke's is kind of like a MacGyver of two salaries. But yeah, top 10 running back, like de facto top 10 running back money for Zeke is couldn't be better because I don't think he was necessarily, well, I mean, the Cowboys were gonna have to pay him anyway, but I don't think he would be going and getting a straight up 7.25 anywhere. That's for sure.
No, I mean,
go ahead, Wiz.
No, I was just going to say, I totally agree. He's a guy that should be, obviously, with his age, Trav, right? Super, super cheap. And if you're just looking to build out depth as an option, right? Like if you've got something from, if you've got some higher end running backs or something like that, and you're looking for some insurance, he's a great insurance option for a contender that, look, if it costs you a 3rd round pick in the future or a 4th round pick in the future, if it provides you depth, if you're that much of a contender this year, then to me that something like that makes sense.
100%, man. And I think like when we look at what they did last year, it's not like they were a super effective running game. And obviously Tony Pollard was a massive factor in that and his inefficiencies, but I'm not going to take a bunch of time to trash Tony Pollard on this show. And we know that like Zeke is not going to bring that explosive element that Tony Pollard was supposed to have brought last year in this backfield. And so while I'm saying Zeke is a winner and while we're saying he's good for a contender, this is purely like a volume play. There's no top 5, top 12 ceiling here. I don't think necessarily with Zeke, but when we look at some of the volume that he should get, the Cowboys last year were middle of the pack as far as rush volume, but they were 9th best in rush attempts inside the 5. And I think that is a massive production avenue for Zeke. I think that is the key to him unlocking any sort of ceiling is getting that. And even more encouraging when you look at Zeke and his profile as a runner. Dallas their runs were stuffed on the 13th lowest rate last year. So their offensive line was doing a little bit of work for that running back, 13th most yards before contact as well. So a little bit of that could be baked in just to kind of boost the floor and maybe just kind of lessen the opportunity for absolute dog shit from Zeke Elliott, right? And so I think this is really going to be good, man. Tony Pollard got over 70% snaps last year. He had over 250 carries, which we don't really want from Zeke. But we saw Zeke get some pretty good target work in New England last season, and Tony Pollard leaves 67 targets behind. So a bunch of work to be had there. And I think he is a big winner, maybe for the short term, not so much for Dino heads, Wiz. When we do look at that short term, I talked about some of them underdog ADPs, and he's currently going in that like 13th or 14th round, which I think is not going to last for very much longer. So if you're in drafts now, snatch him up. I might even go around ahead of that potentially. But what do you think about that? Would you be leaning into my stance there too, Wiz? Do you think maybe Rico Dowdle is a better option than I think he is, or would you just be kind of avoiding and going elsewhere if you're a contender?
No, I mean, I think the point that you brought up, Trav, is really that look, the Cowboys are going to be moving the ball. There's no doubt about that, right? Like we saw them have success through the air last year. You mentioned the inside the 5 attempts, right, that they had last year as well. I think the blueprint is something that like what we saw his last year in Dallas, right, where he was inefficient, right? I think ended up with just under 880 yards. He was under 4 yards a carry, but look, he got all the goal line attempts, right? He ended up with 12 touchdowns there. So he's probably going to be pretty touchdown dependent, but again, at his price point, if you're in a deeper league and you need some RB depth, you could do worse than Zeke Elliott because like there should be some volume there. I do think that Rico Dowdle is probably sprinkled in a little bit to maybe try and keep Zeke just fresher throughout the season. You know, how fresh is a 28 going on 29-year-old running back? But look, I think it's a given that he's going to be getting those goal line carries. And with an offense like Dallas that's going to be in the red zone quite a bit, then it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I absolutely like that. I think another thing that I think with this team as well is I wouldn't put it past them to dip into the free agent running back scrap heap if some guys get let go throughout this offseason. I think you go on Twitter and like every running back that could potentially even be close to available, there's like a tweet that says, what if the Dallas Cowboys traded for Najee Harris? What if the Dallas Cowboys traded for James Conner? It's like, guys, come on. Like, just wait for it to happen. Like, don't speculate about every single running back. It's just like, oh, I wish this wide receiver free agent would go to the Chiefs. It's the same thing, right?
Yeah, I know. I will say, to jump off that point quickly, I will say if there is one running back that could be traded to them, I wouldn't be surprised if that running back is Miles Sanders. Just because they just signed Rashad Penny, they've got Jonathan Brooks, they've got Chuba Hubbard, and when you look, we'll get to them in a bit, but there's some cap numbers to kind of look at there, and it's just I wouldn't be surprised to see them in a market for somebody like that.
Yeah, totally. Going to be some guys available, and I think he's definitely one of them with the incumbent Jonathan Brooks. Hopefully, looking like he's going to set the world on fire in that backfield. Why don't you give me your next winner, Wiz?
So it's a kind of a combination here, Trav. And it's going back to the 2022 wide receiver class. Really a class from a dynasty perspective. They've become, especially, one of them in particular this past offseason, they've really become kind of cornerstone wide receiver assets for some fantasy teams, right? But I think what we've seen up until this point is they haven't produced like those cornerstones just yet. I'm talking about, Garrett Wilson, Drake London, and, to a degree, Chris Olave, who's actually been, the best out of the three from a fantasy perspective so far. But look, we kind of know what happened last year with Garrett Wilson, right? Aaron Rodgers goes out on that, first snap, and all our dreams and hopes or wishes are just dashed. But look, all kind of indications are that Rodgers is going to be back. Like, we're going to see that. So is he the Aaron Rodgers of old? Like, yeah, likely not. But is he an upgrade over everything that they've had those last couple of years with Garrett Wilson? Yeah, absolutely. And, Garrett Wilson won Offensive Rookie of the Year with, Zach Wilson and, a combination of like Mike White and others at quarterback. Mm-hmm. So any sort of upgrade for Garrett Wilson is obviously a win, right? Like, I'm not breaking news there. I think one of the things that, if you're a Wilson owner, is encouraging to see is that they didn't go after somebody like Brock Bowers, right? Like, who would have potentially taken a significant amount of targets away from him, right? Like, they went and drafted somebody like Malachi Corley, like, who I think is a fun player. And, it seems like they have some plans for him. But I just don't see him as like a super high target earner. And, to me, this just screams wheels up with Garrett Wilson. Aaron Rodgers stays healthy. We're going to kind of get that ceiling that we've kind of been hoping for from him to return on that dynasty value. Obviously, Drake London, is just a winner at this point, right? Like, having Cousins come in, it looks like he's, by all accounts, like there's video of him throwing already. Atlanta's had a tumultuous last few weeks with the Penix pick and everything like that. So I guess you could make the argument that, even if Cousins does go down or takes maybe longer to get back or anything like that, that they've got a better contingency plan in place than they have previously. And again, there was rumors there that, potentially they were going after Odunze, or if Neighbors fell or something like that. But those didn't end up happening either, right? So he's got Kyle Pitts there. They brought in Darnell Mooney, but Kirk Cousins has supported 6 wide receiver ones over the last 5 years, right? So we've seen him do it at a high level. Obviously, I'm not putting Drake London in like the Justin Jefferson category, but this was an elite prospect who's still 22 years old and has flashed, at multiple levels, right? I think when you look at Drake London since he's come into the league, even in his terrible situation, out of 65 wide receivers that have run 600 routes, he's still 22nd in yards per route run. So he's still making, the most of a bad situation, in that Arthur Smith offense with Desmond Ridder. So I just think when you get an upgrade like that, Zach Robinson potentially brings over some of those Ram schemes. Like there's a lot to like there as well. And then the last one is Chris Olave, right? And you may be kind of wondering, like, well, how much has actually changed? And because Derek Carr is still there. But I think the big change for me, and this is something that we had kind of talked about off air a couple of days ago, Trav, was, the change in OC, right? Pete Carmichael is out from an offensive coordinator perspective. He was one of those holdovers from the Peyton era. And I think one of the things that I look at with Olave is I just don't think he gets enough credit versus some of the other wide receivers. Since he's come into the league, right? Same sort of thing. If you look at wide receivers with a minimum of 600 routes run, he's 13th in yards per route run, and he's done that with Andy Dalton, then he's done that with Derek Carr, right? So, and again, I'm not saying yards per route run, translates directly to fantasy points, but it's one of the best indicators that we have, right, Trav?
Yeah.
So, I think what we're hoping for with somebody like Chris Olave is we get a bit of a more forward-thinking OC that puts him in much easier, layup target situations where either he's getting some easier looks via play action downfield. They're getting him in motion more because actually, Shadow Football Insights, he actually had a great tweet yesterday that, since or in 2023, Olave via motion, his yards per route run was only behind Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb, right? So this is a guy that has shown chops as a route runner. And yeah, Trav, I just think that those three, they really have a path to, it's year 3 wide receiver, right? We used to talk about that for the wide receivers. So I just think that this offseason is set up nicely for them to finally kind of recognize some of what we've been hoping for to see from them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's really interesting because you look at those three and you see that Garrett Wilson in the perception of dynasty managers is probably like a tier above, right? You and I were talking about it though, and like it seems kind of weird, right? Because if we look at his situation, we maybe have 1 or 2 more years of Aaron Rodgers. And while Garrett Wilson will transcend bad quarterback play, I think like if you look at Chris Olave, his quarterback situation can really only get better. As long as he's getting fed targets, he's going to be just fine. And then Drake London is probably the back of those three. We'll talk about dynasty rankings in a sec, if you don't mind, but I think Drake London might be set up nicest for the future if we look at Michael Penix, because as I've been pondering this move for them, there's part of me that thinks like unlocking some more downfield upside comes with Michael Penix as opposed to coming with Kirk Cousins, right? Saw Michael Penix love to sling it in college. Not that Kirk Cousins can't necessarily do that. And I think he will keep this offense really nice. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying Michael Penix probably comes in and gives similar production, just in a little bit of a different way via more downfield passing. So that's what I'm really excited for with Drake London. Olave, you have just been like, you've been firing off some like sexy little stats about Olave over the last few days. So I can't help but like reassess his dynasty standing for me. And I always liked him. Ohio State fan, fun fact.
Yep.
And so liked him coming in, like the profile, love the way he moves and the way he runs his routes and gets open and stuff like that. And so I think the perception of him is just that dark cloud that is Derek Carr and Pete Carmichael of old. But your point about Clint Kubiak coming in as the offensive coordinator, that's Clint Kubiak's in New Orleans, right? We loved Gary Kubiak. And we know we've been talking about Kevin O'Connell, and I believe Clint Kubiak was the OC for his first year in Minnesota when he came over and started his tenure as well. So we like what he's going to be able to do from that kind of zone running that opens up some of that passing game. And then we see that Chris Olave doesn't have a lot for target competition. So I think $150 on the target meter is probably well within his realm of possibilities. And so when we look at these three guys, I have Garrett Wilson ranked at 6. I do have Olave. I have Olave at 12, but that's a massive tier where he could be at the top or the bottom, and that goes up to like 9 for me. And then I have Drake London at 14, but again, like this is basically from 8 to 8 to 16 could be almost interchangeable for me. But I do have Garrett Wilson just for that short-term ceiling with Aaron Rodgers, maybe a little bit higher. But definitely like dynasty rankings posted on the undroppables.com, of course, are fluid and will always be moving. And so I'll be tinkering with these bad boys throughout the offseason. How would you have them ranked, Wiz?
Yeah, so I think, just for the ceiling perspective, I think I'm not going to disagree with the fact that when you think about some of the stuff that Wilson does after the catch, there's a profile with him and some, production with him that somebody like Olave doesn't necessarily have, right? I think when you mentioned it, Olave is an absolutely like a smooth operator. I think he's already one of the best route runners in the NFL.
Yeah.
But there is an element to his game that, like, from that yards after the catch perspective that he does not have that Garrett does. And I just think that, with somebody like Aaron Rodgers that is still, I think, good enough to support, a wide receiver one season, and just hearing about how Rodgers has spoke about Wilson since he's been there, he's done all the right things. And when you kind of listen to the way Wilson talks, like, it seems like he's got that right mindset. So I think that from a ceiling perspective, that's why I've probably got Wilson ahead of Olave for now. So I've probably got Wilson at that 6-7 range. But I've got Olave like right at that 9-10 range. I lean in there just because I really do think we see a jump from Olave here. He's averaged just about, I think it's like 13.8 points through his first 2 seasons. And I've been saying this for a few months now. I would not be surprised if we saw like a 17 point per game season from him. That he's that kind of player. And, when you look at the run that he went on with Derek Carr after those first 5 weeks, where it was just really bad, right? Like, they were trying to get on the same page. They was checking down all the time. As soon as they started to build that chemistry, Olave went on a really, really nice run, and he was averaging, just about 17 points per game for about 12 weeks of the season. Right. So like that's something where you can you saw it last year. They went ahead and cut Michael Thomas. To your point, the target competition just really isn't there. And then Drake London, I really like the point that you brought up about him from a dynasty perspective. And that is, even if something happened to Cousins, if he ends up leaving in a couple of years, they've got somebody that can come in and push the ball downfield to kind of take advantage of some of the way that he wins. He's a big body, contested catch guy if he has to be. And yeah, I think when you factor in his quarterback outlook, I think he's probably got the best quarterback outlook from a dynasty perspective out of the 3 of them. And that's not really something I had thought about up until this point, Trav. So I think that's a really good point. And that lands Drake London for me, like right around that 10-11 range. So I've probably got about 5 spots from start to finish.
Yeah, no, I think that's nice. And it's so interesting because Drake London's at the back, but we're saying he has the best quarterback situation. Garrett Wilson is at the front. His is a very short term, and we're linking his upside to that quarterback. Chris Olave is the only one who still has that big upside, independent of those outside factors. And so something to think about, Wiz. I really like how you laid that out there. And I love the Chris Olave propaganda over the last week or so. Keep feeding it, brother. Keep feeding it. So I am going to dip into that same draft class for my next winner, Wiz. And you said it a couple weeks ago, and it held true through the draft. Everything that Detroit has done from the wide receiver position this offseason has been a vote of confidence for one Jameson Williams. And I'm starting to get a little steamy on him, Wiz. So first, and I think biggest, and we're going to get back to this a little bit, is that Josh Reynolds left and signed with Denver in free agency. And I'll tell you why that's the biggest factor in a second. But then it's kind of the Ramondre path, right? Like surviving these checkpoints, right? I actually had Detroit as a wide receiver destination pre-draft, and they did not address the wide receiver position in the draft. No wide receivers added. Another good sign for Jameson Williams. Looking at that depth chart as we move towards the season, of course, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta are hogs up at the top. Khalif Raymond right now is looking as the wide receiver 3, Wiz, and I think he's more kind of on the gadget scale of the wide receiver spectrum, let's say. Taking a lot of those end arounds and short things, and trying to get some work after the catch with his speed, but I don't think he's necessarily a huge factor to be a target eater as well. I'll be honest, Wiz, I still have a little bit of a candle burning for Donovan Peoples-Jones, but it's just at a flicker. It's just at a flicker at this point. Not even as burning as the Rashad Bateman candle.
Like a strong gust of wind would like blow that out.
Yeah, like a fart. Yeah, if I farted, it would probably just go. Yeah, totally. I could fart out the Donovan Peoples-Jones candle for sure. But But look, but looking at what Jameson Williams did in 2023, Wiz, it wasn't great. There was some breakout buzz as the season approached, because if you remember, he
Yep.
was discounted because he was suspended for the first 4 games, or I think it was supposed to be
Yep.
6 games, but they changed the rule and it was only 4 or
Yeah.
something like that. So he did play in 12 games. Didn't produce as much as we wanted, of course, but I think that comes with being on the field, right? In those 12
Yeah.
games, only 47% of the team's routes did he run. Only hauled in 24 receptions on 42 targets. You're not shaking a stick at any of that. He only cleared 10 PPR points 3 times last season, and only cleared 13, or he never got more than 13.3. So we didn't see that blow up game that we would think would be absolutely baked in. Like, best ball drafters were just dirt napped after that. So, including myself. So you must be wondering, why the optimism then, Trav? And I think a lot of it, and we've talked about this guy throughout some of our episodes, the continued attachment to Ben Johnson and what he does as the
Yeah.
offensive coordinator. I love that he put aside some of those head coaching opportunities to continue being the offensive coordinator for what looks like kind of just special vibes around this Detroit team, especially last year. They hope they can carry that into this year. And then that Josh Reynolds departure, mainly, Wiz, like, I'm not saying that Josh Reynolds put up huge numbers or he's leaving behind a ton of air yards or a ton of deep targets or anything. But I think what that means is that Jameson Williams is just going to get on the field more.
Yeah.
Jameson Williams, 47% route participation. Josh Reynolds was up over 66%. So I really think that with that, I would project that to go like pretty heavy to Jameson Williams. And so I'm hoping they kind of let the Cadillac out of the garage this season. Really would be fun to see. He just seems like a fun player, right? And led the team in
Yeah.
average depth of target last year. In those 12 games, he was only 6 deep targets behind Amon-Ra St. Brown, with 11 to Amon-Ra's 17. So I think there's plenty of ways that they can produce, even with Amon-Ra and Laporta soaking up almost 50% of the targets like they did last year. Wiz, like, Jameson Williams feels to me like the best third man in for that, because he's a guy who can produce for us from fantasy if we set our expectations correctly on something like 75 to 90 targets, right? We're not
Yeah.
setting our expectations at 1,412 touchdowns for Jameson Williams, but if we can get 4 or 5 blow up weeks that really help us towards a win, I think we're happy with that, right? So definitely an avenue for him to be a bust. I know, like, I'm kind of going a little bit headlong into it, and I think the avenue for a bust is probably reflected in my dynasty ranking. He's the wide receiver 50 right now for me, Wiz, but I don't think it's crazy to say that there's a world that by season's end, he could be in that top 36 if he has a great season and this offense
Yeah.
continues to look like it's humming. What do you think on Jameson Williams? Do you think I'm getting a little too steamy on him? And he is like a back of the 9th, early 10th best ball draft right now. So what's your take on Jameson? You think I might be getting a little too bricked up on him over here?
Well,
Farts
look,
and
I
getting
think the
bricked
way
up,
you
hey?
I think the way you laid it out was perfect, right? Because look, you said some nice things about him. You, like, the checkpoint conversation was great, but at the end of the day, he's still wide receiver 50 for you in Dino, right? Like,
Yeah.
so we're baking in some of the risk that we're talking about here by not ranking him, high at this point. I think what you're kind of looking for, and I will say, I said this to you yesterday. I thought about buying Jameson Williams for the first time in a while in Dino yesterday. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it goes back to what we talked about, right? Like, he's avoided the additions. The departure of Josh Reynolds, I think, is definitely kind of underrated and probably hasn't been talked about enough, right? Like, he had 64
Mm-hmm.
targets last year,
Yeah.
for 40 catches and 600 yards. I think one of the things that's interesting about Jameson Williams is, 18 games so far in his career, right? He's only run 261 routes. So there's really just like not a ton to work with there. However, we've seen how electric he can be with the ball in his hands. I mean, that end around that he took against the Niners in the playoff game, like,
That
he
was so sick.
explodes. He explodes, and you can see it, right? So the fact that they have not brought in anybody additional at this point is really encouraging. What would really suck here is if they brought in somebody like, I know the Chargers have been linked to this guy and, MVS, but if they brought in somebody like that
Yeah.
does, as much as we say MVS sucks, like, they're bringing him in for a reason, and he's going to take, like, Jameson is going to have to capitalize on his volume that he gets, because, to your point, like, Laporta and Amon-Ra are going to dominate a lot of that. But I will say, when you look at some of his, like, targets per route run stuff and everything like that, targets per route run 0.195 so far through 18 games. Obviously, Jordan Addison, he was a rookie last year, and he's run quite, like, Jameson Williams ran 261 routes and Addison ran 560, but he had a higher target per route run than Jordan Addison. right?
Yeah.
And when you look at his yards per route run, because he's that explosive player, obviously some of these are made up of big plays. 1.51, 1.63 for Addison, 1.84 for Pickens, right? So if he's able to take that next step, being attached to such like a good offensive coordinator in Ben Johnson in such a great offense where Amon-Ra and Laporta are going to be taking on the lion's share of that. If he gets some of those opportunities and he can refine his route running a little bit more, I do see a path to him accruing some nice dynasty value this season.
Yeah, totally. And maybe sometimes I am a sucker for those big play merchants, but
Yeah.
fun is fun, and I like fun whiz.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting, and I'm definitely taking. I talked about that underdog ADP. You look at like late ninth, early 10th is where I kind of seen him go. I think his ADP might be a smidgen higher than that, but I'm seeing him slip past ADP. He's going right around guys like Christian Watson, Curtis Samuel, and Mike Williams. I would take him over all three of those. Is there any you'd take over Jameson? Watson,
I
Curtis
mean,
Samuel, and Mike Dubs.
probably Curtis Samuel, just because I
Yeah,
do
fair,
think that there's a
fair, yeah,
role. I think that there's a role for him to have some nice volume in Buffalo. I'm also not like the biggest believer in Keon Coleman. I think that
yeah,
the versatility that Samuel has is going to be really beneficial for them as far as some of the things that they want to do and being able to utilize him out of different personnel. But as far as Mike Williams, you're taking a flyer on a guy that's attached to Aaron Rodgers, but he's also going to be opposite Garrett Wilson. I would almost just lean the upside at that point, right? Because
yeah.
upside wins championships, upside
Yes, it
wins
is.
leagues. So, that's something that I would probably lean Jameson on, just because if he does start to pan out and put this together with his athleticism and some of the things that he's able to do with the ball in his hands, he's got an exciting ceiling.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Fair enough. I think it's interesting to see, right? And maybe at that range of the draft, some of your stacking opportunities are coming into play
Yeah.
and things like that. So I think very interesting conversations to take that shot on the upside there. Okay, Wiz, we're moving off some of those recently drafted wide receivers. Who is your next winner? Who is stacking that dub?
Yeah, so I'm going another kind of aging or veteran running back here, just because I think that it's easy to point out somebody like we just went through with Drake London, obviously getting the upgrade, Garrett Wilson getting Aaron Rodgers back, right? Like those are ones that we want to talk about, but some of the ones that maybe are going under the radar a little bit more, or some of the ones that when you think about like an actionable perspective, how can you improve yourself for as a contender to pick up some running back depth? Somebody that I really like is Aaron Jones. The big thing with Aaron Jones is as always, it's going to be health, right? But he's getting up there in age now, so his price is slightly depressed. I did want to pull this up here, Trav, while I'm talking, because I
Yeah.
did want to see kind of what Aaron Jones is going for
Yeah, you want
recently
to see the
here.
ADP? I can pull her up here if you like while you're chatting.
I wanted to pull up some recent trades as well.
Gotcha.
So okay, so here's another example, right? We just talked about Ramondre going for a second and a future third, right? I wouldn't necessarily go that far maybe with Aaron Jones, but he's going for a 25 second and a 24 third here. If you're a contender in dire need, I think the JJ McCarthy draft pick definitely helped a guy like Aaron Jones,
Yes.
because first of all, right, he's got that receiving profile. He's going to give that rookie quarterback an option to kind of have that outlet. If he's not pushing the ball downfield to Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison and Hawkinson when he gets back. And I do think they're going to be, it's a rookie quarterback, so we have to temper expectations, but I think that offense is going to be in a better spot with somebody like that. So I do think he's still going to have some red zone opportunities. And look, Ty Chandler, I'm not taking him anything away from him. He did some nice things last year when called upon. But at Aaron Jones' price point right now, I mean, he had the second lowest stuff rate in 2023. He was 11th in yards per carry. When you look at the last 3 years from 21 to 23, he's still 13th among running backs in missed tackles forced per rush. And like, so these are some of the things that like he still has juice, and we saw it in the Cowboys game last year, right? Like when he's healthy, he still has it. And again, I just think at a price point for somebody to be some RB depth, or even, if you go hero RB and you're looking for an RB2, I like him to build out a contender here this year.
100%, man. I'm looking at underdog ADP right now, and he's going right at the top of the 7th round. And as a guy who looks like he's going to get like a fat stack of that pie on an offense that we
Yeah.
like to attach to, I love that. Like Aaron Jones is a former heartthrob of the True North Fantasy Pod, shout out. And I don't remember exactly the stats or anything, but what he was doing some historic things as far as converting at the goal line when he was in Green Bay as well. Obviously, some of that might be attached to an Aaron Rodgers offense the defenses are accounting for, but his vision near the goal line and ability to punch it in, moving to an offense that we think is still going to be around the goal line, I think is really nice. And I think he's being undervalued versus like a Josh Jacobs, right? Josh Jacobs is going ahead of Aaron Jones, but I think the ceiling for this season is fairly similar when you look at Marshawn Lloyd coming in behind Josh Jacobs
Yeah, it's a good
and
point.
Ty Chandler being the only guy behind Aaron Jones. So I love him as a winner. I love that.
And when you think about, obviously I mentioned health at the start, right? We saw some of those hamstring issues last year, and it feels like that's been kind of a more prevalent issue these past few years. But before last year, the 4 years before last year, his games played 16, 14, 15, 17, right? His PPR finishes in that time, 2, 5, 10, 9. He's been a top, 10 running back the last 4 years up until last year, right? And when you look at what he still averaged almost 12 and a half points a game last year. And he's just somebody that I think is, to your point, where he's going in that 7th round. If the Vikings offense is better than expected, we've seen when Ty Chandler did come in that they were willing to throw the ball to him. Aaron Jones is a much better receiver than him. He might have a nice floor just from that receiving profile there. And if they are better than more goal line opportunities, you could do worse than Aaron Jones.
Totally, man. And I think like if you look at JJ McCarthy at kind of either side of his range of outcomes, in one situation, he's absolutely dealing to those wide receivers, in which case Aaron Jones has tons of room to run. On the bottom end of that range of outcomes, maybe he's not able to deal it downfield and he just turns into a bit of a check down Charlie. Also good for one Aaron Jones. Before we move off of Aaron Jones, I know I said that I wasn't going to trash Tony Pollard, but you mentioned Ty Chandler. Tony Pollard last year had 17 carries inside the 5, and he only scored 3 times on those. Ty Chandler scored 3 touchdowns on only 3 such carries. And of running backs who had at least 10 carries inside the 5, Tony Pollard was one of only 4 who had 3 or fewer touchdowns. So I know I said I wasn't going to shit on Tony Pollard, but you said Ty Chandler, and it made me think of a fun stat. And we like fun stats here on the Unraveled Fantasy Football Podcast.
Yeah, we do.
Hell yeah. And make sure you go follow Wiz on Twitter at Dan J. Wisner, because he's putting out a bunch of banger fun stats lately. And I try to get in there from time to time, but time doesn't always permit. I think if anybody saw me putting out a fat stats thread every week in the season last year, I'm going to try and do that again. That's where I went through the fantasy points data suite, got a bunch of fun stats from the previous week or trends from the previous 3 weeks, laid them out in a thread, and it seemed pretty fun and good to get out there. So yeah, I'm hoping to do that as well. So Wiz and I will be giving you some nuggets throughout the off season and in.
I was going to say that's going to be something fun to do during the season, Trav.
Yeah, it is really fun. Things are flying in season 2, right? And so I think the fun part about that is when you can find those really good nuggets, it's really helpful for people because they have a short turnaround where they need to action that shit, right? Whereas right now, people could, a month from now, they could come back to this pod. That doesn't happen in season. So when you can add that extra value for the listener, which I think we both like to do, I think our show is going to do pretty well for people throughout the season for sure, as we are throughout the off season too.
Well, and the cool thing about that too, Trav, is, some of that stuff in season like that, obviously, looking at trends from a dynasty perspective is very valuable, but being able to utilize some of that information, from a DFS standpoint, if you're in any redraft leagues as trade targets over the course of stretch runs or anything like that, there's different ways to apply this. And I think one of the things that you and I had talked about was it's really interesting as you go through prep for best ball, how that kind of preps you for redraft. And then that also makes you think about what that does for some short-term dynasty values, right? Like they're almost all intertwined. And when you really kind of think about like the movers and shakers in certain areas, like a best ball, relating that back to dynasty, like there is some correlation there. And it's actually interesting to talk through.
Dude, you're so spot on because like I know for myself, like you just can't turn dynasty brain off, right? And so I'll be going through my best ball rankings, trying to dial in my best ball rankings. I have to remind myself that I'm working on best ball rankings, or I'll have some thoughts while I'm doing my best ball rankings and like, shit, I got to open up those dynasty rankings while this is in my mind so I don't forget it or something like that. So it's interesting. Dynasty doesn't sleep. It just wraps around all the other formats we play. And it allows us to year round get that fantasy goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, so my next winner, Wiz, is Bryce Young from the Carolina Panthers.
Love
And
it.
I know like things are looking bleak coming off of that rookie season. There is no doubt about it. He was the quarterback 23 on the season,
Yeah.
33 from a points per game perspective, less than 3,000 yards, 11 touchdowns to 10 interceptions. And honestly, we don't even need to look into any of the advanced stuff because that tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah.
11 touchdowns, 10 interceptions in 16 games. Ugh. But I will say, Wiz, there is no denying that the Carolina Panthers, as an organization, have done what they can to get him some supporting firepower. They brought in Deontay Johnson, who we love as a target soaker. I love, at least, can't speak for you, Wiz. They drafted Xavier Legette for better or for worse, whether you like him or not. They drafted him in the first round, and everything they have said thus far has been glowing about Xavier Legette. Remains to be seen how they're going to use him, but we know they are going to use him. They added a big bodied seam stretcher tight end in Jatavian Sanders in the third round. And then, of course, heartthrob Jonathan Brooks to bolster that run game in the second round. And of course, they actually invested a bunch of money on the offensive line, which can't really be understated for that young quarterback who's a little bit shorter in stature, maybe has a hard time staying poised in that pocket. The offensive line, I think, is going to be key for Bryce Young. So you can't really say that they're not trying. And I think the biggest add for Bryce Young is going to be Dave Canales at head coach, Wiz.
Yeah.
First off, I want to say we talked about it, I think, last week when we talked about Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels. The Panthers made the right move in hiring an offensive head coach as the head coach instead of a defensive guy with an innovative
Yep.
offensive coordinator. Because if this offense is innovative, he's just going to remain as the head coach as opposed to getting
Yeah.
poached to another team as the head coach coming from offensive coordinator. So I think that's really good as far as continuity for a young quarterback. But looking at what Canales' offenses have done, like he was with the Seattle Seahawks all throughout Russell Wilson's prime. Through that tenure, the Legion of Boom, all of it, he was the wide receivers coach for a bit. He was the quarterback coach for a bit, right as Russell Wilson was hitting his peak. And in Russell Wilson's best season, 2022, where he threw 40 touchdowns and over 4,200 yards, Dave Canales was the passing game coordinator. So he was extremely tied to Russell Wilson producing like we'd never really seen Russell Wilson produce before. Definitely not expecting 40 touchdowns. He's not going to put up a 40
No,
burger,
yeah.
is Bryce Young. But those Seattle offenses, I think what I'm trying to say here is that those offenses were just really efficient, maybe on a little bit of lower volume, always insulated by a strong running game. And all of the kind of tea leaves that we're trying to read through say that they're going to do that here as well with Jonathan Brooks coming in to be hopefully that bell cow a la Rashad White, where Dave Canales was last year, a la Chris Carson previously from Seattle as well. So I think all of that looks really good. Insulating the quarterback. I think we saw some of that with Baker Mayfield last year too, right? They leaned on a bell cow
Yeah.
running back in Rashad White, albeit pretty inefficient. But the Bucks were top 10 in play action pass attempts last year. Bryce Young's Carolina Panthers were third lowest, Wiz. And
Interesting.
the Bucks were top 5 in pass rate inside the 10-yard line last year. So I think this offense is just going to bake in a lot of nice stuff. Baker Mayfield was a top 10 passing yard player last year. He was inside the top 10, tidy little 28 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. So
Yeah.
for me, some of these tea leaves are looking good. Like I'm not a huge Xavier Legette fan by any means. I like Jatavian Sanders to an extent. I love Deontay Johnson. I think
Yeah.
people aren't giving too much credit to Adam Thielen still being in the building because he had like a
Agreed.
massive stretch last year. I
Yeah.
think him and Deontay kind of eat into some of what each other do. So I
Sure.
wonder how that's going to work out per se. But I think at least they're trying, right? And I don't think Bryce Young could be any worse than he was last year. So I would probably be looking to buy Bryce Bryce Young on like a dynasty superflex team where I need a quarterback. I'd probably go up to even a second round pick potentially just for the longevity and
Yeah.
insulation as a first overall quarterback. What would you say, Wiz? Would you go that high on buying a Bryce Young? Would you avoid? What are you thinking there?
No, I think everything that you laid out is extremely valid to what we're talking about is from a value path accrual, right? Like that when we think about how does Bryce Young gain value, it's being insulated by some of the parts that they've brought into the building this year, right? It's actually somewhat of it. You know, I like what they've done a little bit more by bringing in a guy like Canales, but it does remind me of what the Patriots are trying to do, you know, or eventually trying to do with Drake May, right? Is really invest into the offense, invest around the quarterback, and really put him in a position to succeed. You know, you mentioned it with Baker last year. You know, 28 touchdowns, 10 picks. He was QB 10 from a fantasy perspective. Go back a year before, right? Canales was the OC in Seattle. Geno Smith was QB 5. He went 30 and 11 from a touchdown to interception ratio. This guy has most recently, like, you could call him the QB whisperer, which is why I think there's optimism surrounding Bryce Young. And I think some of the points that you brought up are really, really good and need to be kind of hammered home. Is that, look, I think they're going to rely on that run game, and bringing somebody in like Deontay Johnson, who they just did not have a receiver like that last year. I also agree with you that, probably from a real life football perspective, Adam Thielen's going to be, quite a bit more involved. I don't think he's going to be nearly as usable as he was last year for fantasy, but as far as a viable target for Bryce Young down the field, or, towards the boundaries, or even on some crossing roads still, I still think he has value there to that offense. And look, if we can see Jonathan Brooks here get up to speed in, that first month of the season, and there's really no kind of down too much downtime for that ACL, I love his potential in a Canales offense. So now you think about the investment in the offensive line, you think about the investment in the wide receivers from Deontay Johnson, and, we'll see if Leggett works out, but it does, to your point, it seems like they have a plan for him. So look, they're investing in Bryce Young, and they've got the guy to do it who has a very strong recent resume as far as taking quarterbacks out of, let's call it, a dark place and bringing them back towards the light. Right? Like he went down a dark alley with a candle, and he's walked these quarterbacks out. And that's why there's optimism, man. I'm a Canales guy, so I'm curious to see what he does with Bryce Young.
Yeah, he's like the hunchback of Notre Dame, just
perfect.
Fumbling through the tunnel to try and find him a Bryce Young that he can take to the promised land. I like that. That's really good. Good stuff, Wiz. I like it. And yeah, I mean, it's not like we're saying go attach yourself to that Carolina offense, but in bits and pieces where you can find a little bit of value on some of these guys, somebody's going to get work. And I liked what you said about Adam Thielen too. He probably does end up just being like a pain in the ass for your Deontay Johnson and your Xavier Leggett shares. But the real football perspective, he feels like he's probably just like a glue guy in that room, eh?
For what it's worth, too, I do think he's going to eat in a little bit, but look, I also think that Deontay is going to be kind of a target machine.
Yeah, he's a hog.
If you're a contender this year, you could do much, much worse than Deontay Johnson. He's in a contract year this year as well, so he's going to be kind of giving it his absolute all to go out there and get. He's 27 years old. But he's still at that age where, he could get a nice 2-year deal somewhere if he goes out and performs this year. And look, the other thing is, it's not just the quarterbacks that have performed in a Canales offense. We saw both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett eat in Seattle. Yeah. We saw Mike Evans do very well last year as the wide receiver one with Canales and Baker Mayfield, right? So, if he's getting the lion's share of those targets in a Dave Canales offense, I still think he's got a really nice path to a season. And, that's why Jackson and I went and took him in a recent startup we did a few weeks ago.
Giddy up. Okay, Wiz, we're going to try and zip through our last two winners a little bit quick. We are tracking a little bit long, but I mean, we're just having fun. And for any of our listeners, hope you enjoy. If you absolutely hate going into the hour and a half range, let us know. Can't promise that we're going to stop, though. And if you love it, then let us know as well, because we're having fun here. I mean, I don't know if I can speak for you, Wiz, but I could sit here and do this for 3 hours, but we won't put you through that. We did do a 2-hour banger last week, and so we're going to try and keep it a little tight, but we're having fun. We're talking some good shit. So why don't you give me your last winner, Wiz?
Yeah, so I think it's Dalton Kincaid. Now, part of this is because, I see the path to Keon Coleman being successful with the Buffalo Bills, right? Like, if he's able to be that outside receiver that they keep talking about, then we're probably, it's a different conversation as far as how that target share works out, or target pie. But I have some serious questions about that. And if the way I'm looking at this, Trav, is if they stick him out there to start the season and he maybe necessarily fails to make the kind of impact that they're hoping for, then I think they're going to just revert back to, hey, we need something to work from week to week. And, Dalton Kincaid is largely like a big slot receiver. I do think that Khalil Shakir did some nice things there last year, over 15 yards of reception, which is great. But look, they had Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis depart, right? So there's opportunity up for grabs. And the fact that he's got a rapport with Kincaid already, is something it's really enticing to see. I mean, when you think back to last year, right, he finished with 91 targets, 75 catches, and just under 700 yards. So this is, he's almost like early career, or like as he got to the Vikings, like when TJ Hawkinson got peppered with targets when he first got there with Kirk Cousins, if Keon takes longer to get up to speed, I would not be surprised for Kincaid to find himself with a really nice high PPR floor. His yards per target and yards per catch is really on that lower end, right? Yards per target was 7.4, yards per catch was just over 9, right? So he's really not that like seam stretching tight end that you would kind of think with somebody like his body type or anything like that. But look, he's got great hands. It seems like he's got a rapport with Allen, and 73 catches as a rookie tight end is nothing to sneeze at. So I just think with the departures that they have there, he's got an opportunity to come in, especially if that rookie wide receiver in Coleman takes longer to get up to speed.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I am like a huge Dalton Kincaid truther. And so you're pulling on my heartstrings with this one, Wiz. I have him, I think I have him as like my dynasty tight end 4. I think he's in the same tier as Trey McBride personally, maybe a little bit down from Sam Laporta, but there's a world where he's not. Like he could just eventually be operating as the wide receiver 1 for this team, right? And you look at that rapport that you said with Josh Allen from week 7 on last year, only 2 games did he have less than 6 targets. And for a tight end, that's all you can ask for. And he would have to, on that volume, he would have to be like me playing tight end out there to not produce as a top 12 tight end, getting that kind of volume. And so that's just baseline, right? That's not including the addition of his profile and his talent and what he can do on his own, right? And so, yeah, I love everything you said about Dalton Kincaid, and he's one of my favorite tight ends this year because I just kind of see him as that team's wide receiver 1, despite Curtis Samuel, despite Keon Coleman. And Keon Coleman playing as the X is good for Dalton Kincaid. That keeps him in the slot, keeps him there, right? And I think if a lot of talk about Keon Coleman coming into the slot, and if they're taking a guy that they drafted with pick 33 and saying they're going to move him into the slot, that's not good for Dalton Kincaid. But everything that they're saying is that he's going to be playing the big X, and whether we like Keon Coleman there or not, I think that is positive signs for Dalton Kincaid. And yeah, I like it. I'll be having quite a bit of him, I think.
I think it's a good point to keep an eye on, Trav, right? If we notice that, he's outside at X to start the season and really starting to struggle there, that's definitely something, as they start shifting around, if the conversations start having, we're going to start moving him into the big slot and trying that out, that's something that you would definitely have to monitor to keep that in mind. But look, if we're listening to coach speak right now and they really want to try him out there, then I think Dalton Kincaid is going to have a lot of opportunity there, because I don't think that, Keon Coleman is going to be garnering the sort of target share that, even like Gabe Davis had 95 targets last year, right? Like that's still a decent amount of targets. So the fact that there's all those targets on the outside that have kind of left in Diggs and Davis, obviously, Samuel will eat up some of those, but more in that kind of Z flanker role. Yeah, I think there's a nice opportunity for Kincaid here to get off the ground pretty quickly, especially with that high PPR floor.
Yeah, totally. And he was drafted 8 picks higher than was Keon Coleman. So it's not like the Bills aren't super invested in him succeeding as well. So I'm going to whip off my last winner here, Wiz. It's interesting because I called this guy a sell a couple weeks ago with his price point creeping up near top 12 running back status, and that would be Isiah Pacheco. Not backing off of that stance fully either, Wiz. I think from a dynasty lens, I would still be selling him on those prices. But for the foreseeable, for 2024, he was a massive winner. The Chiefs didn't add anybody in the running back room, and I definitely thought they were going to surprise us with a running back pick there. But they didn't. They obviously added Xavier Worthy as a weapon to take some of that defensive attention away. They brought back Clyde Edwards-Helaire, which I think is only a positive for Isiah Pacheco, because Clyde's not wrestling a bunch of that work away. Looking at what Isiah Pacheco did last year, running back 14 in points per game, running back 15 on the season. Fun little fact for you. Shout out to my guy Ty, who dug this one up. Last season, Isiah Pacheco had the 15th best fantasy season of any running back selected in the 7th round. Another name that we might like in that category is a Chris Carson, another really hard runner, but definitely bigger body than Pacheco. But I thought that was pretty interesting to see him, just kind of shout out to him succeeding despite that low draft capital, right? He came in with Clyde as a first round running back, and he has done nothing but impress. Looks like he definitely has another season like that on the docket, right? So my sell stance is more of a long-term play than a short-term play. I think top 12 could be in the realm of possibilities depending on the volume. He's not necessarily going to be a league leader in carries or targets, but it's the type of carries and targets that he gets, right? He has a stranglehold on the goal line work on a team and an offense that's basically a goal line magnet. And I think he's going to get enough targets to boost that lack of pure carry total, right? Last year, he got 49 targets, which isn't like league leading status, but of course, targets are 2.5 times more valuable than carries. And he got some of those. So I think this offense just offers a lot, right? Each of the past 3 seasons, they've been top 10 in receiving yards, receptions, and receiving touchdowns to running backs. Obviously, we know that pie has been spread out between a couple guys, including Jerick McKinnon and Clyde. But as of right now, Jerick McKinnon is not back with the Kansas City Chiefs. So I think some of that pie could get bigger potentially for Isiah Pacheco. And I think that's just good, right? That allows him to buoy himself into that top 12 realm.
Yeah.
Where are you sitting? Like, are you in on that kind of top 14, top 15 Isiah Pacheco, or you got a little bit of trepidation too?
So look, I think the price makes me nervous a little bit. But I think when you look at what the avenue is for production, I think everything that you just laid out is extremely accurate, right? When you look at what he's done since he's come into the league, right? 31 games, 375 carries, he's got a 4.71 yards per carry. It's 14th best in the league, right? So some of that is because of the attention that, some of the passing game weapons in KC do deserve, right? But he's made the most out of that, right? And I think one of the things that you did mention that is really important to note is that McKinnon was still there last year, albeit, he had gotten another year older, but to go from 14 targets his rookie year to 49 that next year, that's how you start unlocking that ceiling, right? I mean, like he played in 17 games that prior year, his rookie year. He only had 35 less carries, but he ended up as the, running back 15 in PPR. And if he's able to kind of live in that, 50 to, maybe he expands on it a little bit more here, Trav, in year 3, maybe he can get up to 60 targets and, catch 35, 40 balls, or 50 balls, whatever that is. The other thing to keep in mind is that, we had some more Rashee Rice news today, right? Where he's being investigated for, assaulting, I think, a Dallas nightclub owner or something like that.
I thought it was a photographer or something, but either way.
Photographer. Yeah.
Either way.
So like, they're probably going to have to be dealing with not just, everything that we had with the accident earlier on. This could be like an extended absence for, Rashee. And if that's the case, obviously to your point, they brought in Worthy, they brought in Hollywood, but with a passing game option not in the fold like a Rashee Rice, definitely opens up a little bit more opportunity for Pacheco as well, right? So the fact that they haven't brought anyone in, it would be interesting to keep an eye on them throughout camp, because if they do, I think this is a conversation that we have to revisit. But again, we're talking about checkpoints right now, and he's kind of gone through those as well. If there was an episode title for this, Trav, this should be like the checkpoint episode.
Something about checkpoints,
something about checkpoints. But I'm with you, man. I like the avenue.
Yeah. Farts and checkpoints or something like that. There was something else that was outlandish that we brought up shortly after that, but I digress. Wiz, we're going to move into our losers in just 1 second, but we've been talking a little bit of underdog ADP, and it is best ball season, buddy. You and I were on a call last night, and we were kind of just roster baiting some of our best ball teams, and it was really fun. And so I just want to let the people know that they can have that kind of fun too. Underdog Fantasy has a ton of tournaments out there right now. We're thinking about setting up some of our own private drafts as well, so stay tuned on that. But if you go there and you sign up at Underdog Fantasy to get playing, use the promo code UNDROPPABLES, get a special pick in the lobby, which is dope. And then on your first deposit, you can get an instant match of up to $250. So if you drop 250, Underdog will match 250. You're rolling into your drafts with a cool 5 bills. And that is nice. You can make a lot of hay in some of those tournaments, especially when they get the little $3 or the $5 ones, or even the 10s. Best Ball Mania is going on right now, and those drafts are exciting. That's a $25 buy-in. There's really something for everybody over there. They also have the Pick'ems, NBA playoffs, hockey playoffs, all that stuff. You can go in there you can give the over or the higher or the lower on that stuff. So we love playing on Underdog. They are a huge supporter of the Undroppables brand, and we can't thank them enough for that. So go check it out. Use that promo code Undroppables. Get a little something off the top, and maybe you could start making some cheddar on there as well. So lots of fun in the best ball streets, Wiz, but we're going to dive back into these dynasty streets with some people who were losers coming out of the draft and throughout this offseason. You can go first on this one if you don't mind, my man.
So we're gonna head to Denver. And one of the things that I just wanted to pull up here, I wanted to see the latest expert consensus. So he's actually fallen a bit here. Wow, interesting. Okay. Javonte Williams, Trav, is somebody that I think we all had high hopes for. I actually mentioned this the other day, but when you looked at on Twitter, but when you look at where he was tracking up until he got hurt last year, he was third in missed tackles forced per rush attempt since he joined the league, and he was fifth in missed tackles forced per touch. Right? We we had seen some of that receiving work up until he got hurt last year, and that's kind of what made him really enticing. Is that it's not like he's a burner by any means, but the fact that he was able to contribute in both the rushing and receiving game is something that I think was really enticing for a while. But just some of the things that Denver has done, it's really hard to kind of ignore what his dynasty outlook looks like right now, right? We saw Jaleel McLaughlin do some nice things last year from an efficiency standpoint. Some of that was probably maybe he got more opportunity because, it feels like Javonte came back too fast, but they swear he was healthy. But then, they go out and take somebody like Audric Estime in the draft here, who's young back, obviously later round pick. So we'll see what happens as far as, how much work he's able to take away. But Samaje Perine's still there. And we've seen Sean Payton work with multiple backs, right? And so when I just think that he's got this big time knee injury, they didn't get rid of Perine, at least just yet. They added another back in Estime. Maybe with a draft like drafting a QB like Bo Nix, maybe they lean on the run game a little bit more for that rookie quarterback. But the problem is, Trav, you can't project all that work to go to Javonte Williams, right? Like there's so many guys in the fold here where I just think it's super, super murky. And the problem is, I just looking now, he's dynasty running back 18, right? He's expert consensus rankings at Fantasy Pros. If you just kind of go off that, I mean, Ramondre's ahead of him, a winner that we had talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that, he's a couple years younger than Ramondre, and we've seen him dip down to 18. You've got a great running back class coming in next year. He's going to be in a muddy situation for a while. I have a really hard time seeing this get better, Trav. So I almost feel like try and find a league owner that, still believes in the idea of Javonte and get out while you still can, because, I just don't see the path to the opportunity for him to increase his value.
No, and it's just like I can attest to the fact that it's an extremely frustrating backfield to have on your squad, right? And like Dynasty running back 18 by ECR, I actually have him as Dynasty running back 26 because I've seen that writing on the wall already, right? I think like if we look at the short term, it's really murky because we want him to be a bell cow. I love Javonte Williams. Like I love him. I love him. He's one of my favorite running backs coming out. I have a bunch of shares of him in my dynasty leagues, and it's just been super disappointing. And now we see that the guy we want to be a bell cow multi-purpose back has players on the team that are capable of taking away each of those purposes, right? Audric Estime can take that first and second down work. Jaleel McLaughlin can take a lot of those carries, right? Like I see Estime and McLaughlin would be a dynamite little tandem for a running back room, but Javonte Williams in there, it almost feels like he's the wrench in the plans as opposed to the other guys. You know what I mean? It's just such a weird thing. And talk about Adam Thielen being a pain in the ass for your wide receiver shares. Samaje Perine is the textbook pain in the ass for a running back room because he's reliable. Coaches trust him and they're going to give him some touches. So I really like Javonte as a loser because I think that I think he's been losing for almost like a year and a half now. You know what I mean? But he hasn't really been super acknowledged. And I think it's important to get it out there because some of the things that we've been seeing hint at the fact that we might not want to be investing at, like you said, those dynasty running back 18 prices.
Yeah, so Trav, I think I would be hesitant in investing at those prices too, right? Especially when you think about the class that's coming in next year. If you can potentially get out for something like a future draft pick or something like that to, get that better store of value than potentially what Javonte Williams is this year, that's definitely something that I would be looking to do at this point. Just because, look, I think we love what the player could have been when he came into the league, but I think, look, we have new information. That backfield's murky. He's had an injury, and I think it's time to act accordingly before maybe you're left holding the bag for too long, right? I think he's still at a point where you can sell him for something, and I just think the odds of him rising significantly from here again are kind of on the long shot for him.
Yeah, totally. Like if I would probably be looking at like back of second round rookie draft prices, some, or maybe you need a wide receiver and you go get yourself like a Jalen McMillan or something like that, or maybe dip into that lower rookie running back pool with like a Jalen Wright plus or something for Javonte Williams. I think those could be nice moves that you could potentially make. So I'm going to stay in the running back ranks here, Wiz, and I'm going to talk about Kyren Williams. So I have a little bit of a history of dogging Kyren Williams, to be honest with you. I wasn't doing undroppable stuff last season, but as he was kind of having that blow up early in the season, I was saying, let's be careful, guys. This standing could be fickle for Kyren Williams. And it wasn't. He had a great season. It was awesome.
Yeah.
He was like a monster running back producing. But I think it's wild to me that people had him locked in as a top 10 dynasty running back. I'm seeing him go at the top of the second round. And I've said this on previous shows too, Wiz, so I'm not going to get too deep into that necessarily, but I just think this offense is going to be churning through those running backs. And you look at Kyron's season last year was not the most efficient. He was outside the top 25 in explosive rush rate for running backs with at least 100 rush attempts. Out of the 23 running backs with 200 plus carries, he was 16th in explosive rush rate. And then, of course, his missed tackles forced and his yards after contact were outside of the top 15 in that 100 carry group. But I think for me, the biggest hit that he's going to take from a production lens is not only splitting work with Blake Corum, but ceding work to Blake Corum near the goal line. We know that Blake Corum is a great goal line runner. I think he's going to get some of that work like as early as like a quarter of the way through the season, potentially. Kyren Williams had 85% of the team's carries inside the 5 last season. Only Saquon Barkley had a higher rate, and he had 100% for the Giants. So I think it's hard to see that continuing with them taking a third round running back, right? 9 of Kyren Williams' 12 touchdowns were from inside the 5, and 11 of his 12 touchdowns were from inside the 10-yard line. So Blake Corum getting carries in the red zone is going to eat into that. Those 10 zone touchdowns, 11 of them is 5.5 points per game for Kyren Williams. So I think that would be a fairly significant hit. And I think a lot of his value is tied to that because the pass catching pie is not huge here. The Rams only gave him 47 targets last year, 32 receptions. So it's not like he's going to be a 70 plus target guy where he can seed all of those carries and still be buoyed by that pass catching work. But I don't know, man. A fun stat that I had for Kyren Williams, of the 60 running backs with at least 20 targets, he was 59th with 0.68 yards per
Yeah.
route run. So obviously, like running back routes are a lot different, right? And we don't
Mm.
necessarily link yards per route run directly to a running back. But if we want to look at ways that he can supplement losing some of those carries, I don't think it's going to be via that pass catching work. So I've got some concerns for that production. What are you thinking for Kyren? Like, I know you might not be as high on Blake Corum because we've talked about it, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing with this backfield? Because it feels like they're going to be in flux sometime in the next couple of years. So to me, investing that pick in Kyren Williams, especially from a dynasty perspective, is just feels like it's going to be fool's gold sooner rather than later.
Look, so I think the way I think about Kyron is if I own him, and I do in a couple orphans that I took over last year, Trav, I would definitely and am definitely looking to move off of him for, kind of what I can get right now. Right. And I think some of I went ahead and pulled up Dynasty Data Lab and, some of the things that you can move off of Kyron for right now. Tank Dell and a 2025 second, right? Like
Oh,
that's one option. A 2025 first, you can still go ahead and get, right? There's deals of here, even as of a couple days ago, 2024 first, right? So if you're looking at, a running back needy team that is maybe a contender that's just saying, hey, look, I need a running back right now. I'm willing to give up, whether it's a later first or whatever. I think that that's an option there. Look, one of the things that Sean McVay does is he does tend to ride the hot hand.
yeah.
And what will be interesting to see, though, is we saw them try to do it last year with Kyron, but he didn't hold up. Right. And I think that's why they went ahead and invested in somebody like Blake Corum with that 3rd round draft capital, because they need a viable option in the event that Kyron goes down. Right. And so that's where I think your point about the receiving work, though, Trav, is really what would have me. It's not like he's got that floor to kind of boost him if he starts losing some of that, let's call it those red zone carries to Blake Corum. Part of me wants to like pump the brakes a little bit and just make sure that like we're not doing, Tank Bigsby and Travis Etienne last
Fair,
year. But look,
fair.
I think those are different players as well. Sean McVay's resume will tell us that, he will ride the guy. But at the same time, if Kyron proves that he's going to continue to miss time, whether it's, 4 games here, 3 games there, whatever, whenever that happens, if Blake Corum comes out and balls, I could see a situation where, Kyron does not get the job back in the manner that he had it previously. And if that happens, like your window's already closed to sell him at that point, right? So, being a 5th round pick, murky waters anyways, I would definitely be more inclined to move off of him at this point. So I'm in agreement with you.
Yeah, and looking at what you probably invested in him to get him on your team, you are
Exactly.
stacking profit on that. And actually was one of the more important factors in some of this stance that I didn't even mention yet is the contract. He is on his rookie contract, Kyron Williams, but that contract is up after 2025. And I think if he continues to produce at this clip, he's going to want big running back money. And I'm not sure the Rams are going to be willing to invest that in him, especially with some of the big wide receiver contracts that they've got, depending on what they do at the quarterback position and retooling that defense. And of course, maybe some PTSD from the Todd Gurley deal. I have a hard time seeing them investing like top 10 running back money, top 5 running back money in Kyron Williams. Because if he produces at the clip that he did last year, he's going to want something like that.
Trav, that's a really good point, and it almost makes you wonder if they're starting to think about life after Kyron Williams, right? Like maybe it's not directly this year if he ends up, being able to get through the year healthy and everything like that. But if he continues to play the way he is, of course he's gonna want to go seek money elsewhere. And now you have a 3rd round rookie on a running back deal it's going to be nice and cheap that at that point Sean McVay would likely trust. So yeah, I mean, the other thing to keep in mind too is I think Coop mentioned this on Twitter. So if you don't follow him, Coupe Fiasco on Twitter, Kyron struggled last year in pass pro, right? I'm not saying that Blake Corum is one of the better pass blocking backs in the class by any means, but Kyron struggled last year, and priority number 1 is keeping Matthew Stafford upright and healthy. So if he continues to struggle in that area and maybe fails to be on the field for some of those 3rd downs, and leads to those lack of targets that you kind of spoke about, that's just something to keep an eye on too.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Wiz, all right, give me your next loser. Luhu, Zahur. You know what that's from? Tell me you know what movie that's from. Oh my God. It's even a football movie. Do you know the dolphin? Does he call you at home? Do you know that? It's Ace Ventura, dog.
I feel like you see, I haven't seen Ace in forever. Honestly, dude, full disclosure, I don't know if I've ever seen Ace Ventura from start to finish.
Oh my God.
I swear to God, I don't know if I
this
have.
podcast, and I might even have to rethink our podcast partnership after this. No, I'm kidding. Like that's probably like I had that on VHS back in the day, and like when I was like that age, it was almost like a little bit edgy for a kid my age to be watching, and so I wore that motherfucking VHS out, dude. That's probably my most quotable movie is Ace Ventura. Absolute classic. Laces out Dan. And speaking of Dan, Wiz, who's your next loser?
Yeah, so Trev, my next loser is or kind of a tag team here, right? And I think it's it's short term for one of the rookies that we're going to be talking about here in a second, but also it does put a damper on this veteran as well. So it's Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze. And look, it's a situation where for Caleb Williams, this is fantastic, right? And from a Bears offense and real life NFL perspective, go ahead and taking Odunze and providing that young quarterback with all those weapons at his disposal is something that like I love the fact that they've just leaned into that and leaned into giving him that ecosystem to succeed. But the reality is here that this caps Rome's ceiling year 1. And this also eats into Keenan's a little bit as well. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if it was just Keenan and DJ there before, I think, you're looking at Keenan being that, primary underneath deep and also being able to win at the boundary, not as much as DJ Moore, but getting some more looks downfield. I think in this Shane Waldron offense, I wouldn't be surprised to see like a decent amount of Keenan's maybe more intermediate or downfield routes taken away by Rome Odunze. And the other thing is, if Rome is kind of working in that area of the field, is he getting some of those easier layups that are likely being fed and filtered through Keenan Allen, right? So again, real life perspective, I think these three actually complement each other very, very nicely. But at the same time, we're just, because there's less of a pie to go around now, I think we have to kind of recalibrate our ceilings here. I think it affects DJ Moore to a certain point, which we kind of knew was going to happen anyways because Keenan was coming in. But I think DJ Moore, his ability to make big plays and win downfield. I'm not saying that Rome can't, but he's more explosive than that. And I just think he's not going to leave the field, right? And I see times where, maybe as the season goes on, also there's that injury history with Keenan. There's going to be, I think you're going to see more switching between Keenan and Rome than necessarily DJ Moore coming off the field. So look, if anything, we've talked about it before in some past ones, if this ever opened a window for Rome Odunze, for anybody getting frustrated with him or anything like that, obviously go ahead and jump on that because of Keenan's age. But I think, from a expectations perspective for 2024, you have to recalibrate what they're doing there. I think I heard Matt Harmon talking on the Reception Perception pod earlier today, and I think they were going through some over-unders for the rookie wide receivers. And I think the one on DraftKings for Rome Odunze was something like 675 yards, right? And, that's almost like right where Jackson Smith and Jigma's rookie season was last year. And obviously, coming out, all this hype around Rome and everything like that, if that happens, it's obviously a disappointment, but like you can just get an idea of like where some of the books are kind of thinking that this is going to happen because there's three legitimate wide receivers there now.
Yeah, and I think I've kind of already resigned myself to just knowing that his rookie season is probably going to be a disappointment to an extent versus what we project for him over the long term. This is Odunze when he has more of that secure role when Keenan Allen is gone, right? And so like I talk a lot about making sure we set accurate expectations. Like I wasn't changing the value that I would be drafting Rome Odunze at because I think he does have the avenue to hit that ceiling after this season. So you still draft him as the wide receiver 3 off the board in your dynasty rookie drafts, but just know that you're going to take some lumps, maybe a little bit later in the draft or maybe on the free agency or trade market. You might want to insulate that wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 position on your roster for a season. But that's where you can, get some of these guys who are just going to be fillers, and you can spot start some of these guys throughout this season and just know that Rome's going to be a locked in, probably a guy who you're using as the wide receiver 2 on your team, but has legitimate wide receiver for fantasy upside. I think maybe not one overall at this point until we see how Caleb Williams pans out, but he definitely has top 12 upside once they get that rapport and he gets cemented in there. So I like that on the Bears because it's definitely a big hit to those guys. And we need to make sure we acknowledge that, especially on the Keenan side too. So we're not getting, too hyped up about him potentially being a guy who's going to give us more than just this year, because I'm treating him as a this year proposition and we're going year by year after that.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, bruv. My next one, another pairing, but in the running back ranks, I shall stay. And we are going to the Miami Dolphins and talking about Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane. And most of this take is towards Mostert as opposed to Achane, because I think Achane's cemented in there as part of whatever tandem they employ for the next few seasons. But man, I think we look at Jalen Wright coming in there. I think he does a lot of the things that both of these guys do, right? The explosive plays, taking advantage of that offense that's going to open massive holes. We saw Jalen Wright at Tennessee almost needed a massive hole to break off a big play because he wasn't getting through a ton of those tight spaces and he really needed to have that lane, maybe some vision issues. But I think the place that he went really can mitigate some of those vision issues to make him a thorn in the side for these other guys, right? We look at Raheem Mostert. He is there this year, but I would say he's probably going to be gone after this season because they're pretty tight on the cap and they can save $3 million next year by cutting him. So I think he's probably gone after this season. And I think throughout this season, we're going to start to see some of that changing of the guard, because much like Keenan Allen, that injury history for Raheem Mostert is going to rear its ugly head. And I think that's going to give Jalen Wright some opportunity to come in here. And it'll be interesting to see what he can do, because I could see him smashing in that offense and Mike McDaniel having a hard time keeping him off the field, a la what he did with Devon Achane last year, who also has some injury history early in his NFL career.
Yeah.
It could open up some lanes for Jalen Wright. So yeah, I mean, I definitely am not trying to trash Raheem Mostert because he's been fantastic, right? He was a big play monster, running back 5 last year, running back 4 in points per game. But I think for him, like we look at a running back like him and we're looking at when that cliff is going to come. And I think the cliff for Raheem Mostert is being in a non-Mike McDaniels offense, right? Like I think if he goes somewhere else, he can produce, but I don't think he's going to produce to the level that he's going to in Miami. So I'd be trying to get the hell off of Raheem Mostert as fast as I can and getting on to Jalen Wright and Devon Achane. I can't get that one fucking right for some reason. It's like Devon. Like what is it? I think it's Devon. So anyway, Devon
I
Achane.
think it's Devon.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
It's
so like
tough
I don't
though.
think it's a huge loss for Achane, but I think just it means that the writing is on the wall for Mostert at least.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would agree, man. And I think what we saw from Mostert in 2023 is just, in my eyes, it's just completely unrepeatable.
Yeah.
18 touchdowns last year. From just a rushing perspective, I think he had 20 touchdowns total or something like that. But when you look at his, if you look at rushing attempts per touchdown, and you just kind of look back since 2021, right? Minimum 100 attempts. And the average is right around, 0.03, 0.034, minimum 200 attempts. Mostert last year was at 0.86, right? So like he is so far and above like like expecting negative regression is like almost like an understatement there. Some of the past guys in here have dropped anywhere from 30 to 40%. And look, that would still put him at, 8 or 9 touchdowns or something like that. But when you take 8 or 9 touchdowns away, he's not this ceiling. I just don't think if people are going in expecting another, RB5 finish, I think that's where you need to recalibrate your expectations, right? Do I still think he can be useful for this year potentially?
Exactly.
Yes. I also think that your concerns about his health are absolutely valid as well. But this does to me, when you look at a lot of people are talking about, well, he was extended. Well, he actually wasn't. I mean, if there's no guaranteed money after this season, right? So
Yeah.
it was really more of a restructure than anything else. So look, if you're not competing, absolutely look to move Mostert now and try to capitalize on anything you can get left. But it does seem like, look, get Jalen Wright in the building this year, get him up to speed so that when the end of 24 comes, they can move on from Mostert and still have those kind of 2 explosive backs that they would like to have.
Yeah, I think regardless what we're saying is that the Miami Dolphins is going to be like a track meet offense still. Just added Odell Beckham. They also have Malik Washington, who we like. Whether Mostert is there or not, their running back room is going to be electric as well. So if there's a guy whose role is cemented in Miami or even a hair cemented, we probably want to attach to that guy to an extent. Just evaluate which guy it is based on your roster, right? Mostert's great for a winning team. Jalen Wright's great for a rebuilding team. And Devon Achane's just good for all teams. Okay, Wiz. So you hit us with your next loser. Then I'm going to trim mine down and give them quick, and then you can follow up with your last.
Yeah. So look, Josh Jacobs, I think with the Marshawn Lloyd pick, there's risk there. Some people will point to the fact that, he just signed that 4-year, $48 million deal. That deal is a surface level deal. I took a little bit of a deeper look at it today via Over the Cap. And, the Packers can actually get out of Jacobs' contract as soon as next year, post June 1, with as little as like $9.5 million in dead cap, right? Which we've seen teams be more than happy to eat much more than that. So if things don't go well this year, his efficiency dropped off a cliff last year. They invested in Marshawn Lloyd. They're already talking about how they like some of the things that Marshawn Lloyd brings to the table from a size speed perspective. And typically when you look at LaFleur's splits, he doesn't employ a bell cow as it is, right? Like we saw, for better, for worse, we saw AJ Dillon eat into Aaron Jones's workload too much, right? And
for worse.
Yeah, for worse, right? And so the reality is that even though they signed Jacobs to this contract, it absolutely sounds like they have plans for Marshawn Lloyd. And the thing is, this doesn't feel like just coach speak, because we've got multiple seasons of LaFleur actually backing this up from, kind of a committee perspective, right? So I think anybody kind of thinking about like, hey, he was on the, a shitty Raiders team last year. Well, I'll implore you to look at the fact that like Zamir White came in after, Jacobs had kind of got hurt, and they pivoted to him at the end of the year and was much more effective than Josh Jacobs, right? And it's not like Zamir White's a great running back. So look, anybody thinking that Jacobs landing in this better offense, who's probably going to have more opportunities, that's probably true. But I just don't think that the lion's share of those opportunities, to the degree that people think, like, are going to be going to Jacobs. I think Marshawn Lloyd's going to have a real role, and this could very much be like the new Jalen Warren kind of Najee Harris
Nice,
situation.
yeah.
I'm not saying he didn't come up with the Packers, but we could see Jacobs' efficiency continue to fall and Marshawn Lloyd kind of be at the other end of the spectrum. And, that would be a really interesting scenario. And if Marshawn Lloyd takes more steps this year, sooner rather than later, that out in 25 definitely looms large.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge. And I was watching, shout out to Mr. Barrett, recent guest of the show over at fantasypoints.com. Watched his episode where every season he watches all of the post-draft pressers and spits out all the information that he found interesting. He watched 50 hours of post-draft pressers. It's like the most beautiful kind of psychopath, that man, I tell you what.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. And one of the things that the Packers staff was saying was that they love his pass catching prowess. And so I love what you said about the transition from the pie in Vegas to the pie in Green Bay, because it's probably a lot tastier pie, but it's a much smaller piece. He's going from like a
Yeah.
10-inch round to like an 8-inch round, and maybe he already has like a piece cut out of it. You know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
think that's very well put on Josh Jacobs, because I think a lot of people might have been a little bit blind to that, just seeing the deal that he got, seeing the talent going into that higher powered offense than Vegas. They thought he was going to be unleashed, but temper those a little bit. I fully agree on that one.
And real quick, just to kind of tie off the Jacobs thing, shout out Ryan Heath over at Fantasy Points, but he had a tweet earlier. Josh Jacobs averaged 17.2 weighted opportunities last year and scored 13.9 actual points per game. That negative 3.3 differential is the fourth worst of any running back over the last decade. Right. So like, this isn't just like he had a bad year. Like, he had from a weighted opportunity, like, performance perspective with what he was given, he was one of the worst running backs like over the past 10 years. So it's just something to think about with somebody who could be potentially coming in and showed some really nice efficiency in college.
Yeah. Yeah, well put, my man. I'm gonna give you both of mine just to ride out, and then the floor will be
Yep.
yours. So the first guy that I like, these are all kind of low hanging fruit too, just because I think we should mention him. Kirk Cousins, obviously, in Atlanta. But my note here says not the pass catchers, and some of that links back to the conversation we had earlier with Drake London and Michael
Yep.
Penix for the long term. But obviously, like, this is very obvious. Michael Penix, 8th overall pick. I think there's like a minor win in here for Kirk Cousins, because no matter what happens, they're going to pay him a shitload of money. So, I mean, obviously, as a competitor, he wants to play, but the dude could retire after this year, and Atlanta is still going to be paying him a boatload for the next couple. Obviously, we like the Zach Robinson offense, so this is purely just from a long-term longevity in this offense standpoint. But if we could kind of tag on to this one on the Penix front, one point that Jax made on last week's episode of Undrafted with Chalk, shout out, go listen to it on the Player Profiler Podcast Network. He said that Michael Penix at like the early to mid second is a conversation that we need to start having, because if we're a rebuilding team, he could potentially be worth that weight, essentially, was what the take was. It wasn't verbatim necessarily, but he said that if you're on a rebuilding team, they're not just going to not try out their top 10 overall pick. So at some point, we know that he's going to get some run. And so I've been kind of coming around a little bit to that. And that kind of goes into that stance I was saying about how these wide receivers might have a really good quarterback situation for the long term, because the transition from Cousins to Penix could be fairly smooth, which is the Atlanta Falcons plan, to be honest with you. So if that works out that way, then maybe they didn't make such a dumb move, but I think it's still a dumb move. But would you, if you're a rebuilder, do you think that Penix could be worth that weight? Or would you be trying to push yourself up that board to try and get one of those other guys who has locked in playing time?
Look, I think it depends where you're at in the rebuild. If you're absolutely tearing it down and you think it's going to take more than a couple years, I think Penix is a interesting investment, because to get somebody like him, he's just comes at such a discount versus those other QBs, right? And if that's somebody that as your team, as kind of Cousins goes through his deal, potentially Penix comes into play 2-3 years from now, an asset like Penix, first of all, you could either use him on your team once you're ready to compete, or if you've been able to build out quarterback elsewhere in the meantime, now you've got a really nice trade chip to maybe get a last piece elsewhere, right? Like maybe you're a wide receiver short, or you need a tight end or something like that, right? I think he's a nice store of value, because I do think that as time ages on, his value is just going to start creeping up and creeping up and
Yeah.
creeping up.
Boom. Okay, my last couple, Debo or Brandon Ayuk I had, just because one of them is probably going to be out the door, and Ricky Pearsall
Yep.
just kind of cemented that. And the main reason they're a loser is it's going to be really hard for them to find an offense that puts them in such
Yeah.
advantageous positions like the Niners. So whoever leaves the door, I think we're going to see a little bit of a dip from. And then the other guy, just because of the news that you alluded to, is Rashee Rice. The guy cannot stay out of the headlines as of late. We obviously know that car accident that he was in, where he was getting some heat for that. And just today, this went our Tuesday night. Just today, it was reported that he punched like a Dallas photographer or something, like we talked about earlier. So, he's going to be a loser from a production standpoint, but I think he's just like he's painting himself as a loser to like
Yeah.
other NFL teams and to
Yeah.
people who were supporting him. And like, I am one who can kind of see into, or I like to kind of think about that situation, right? Because if I'm like a 22-year-old dude and I'm going through a lot of heat and my career feels like it's in the balance after a car accident, and I have all this shitty media, I have photographers in my face when I'm trying to like just enjoy myself and stuff, like there would probably be times where I might want to turn around and throw some hands on one of those guys myself too. And so I don't know the situation. And so I just wanted to say that, because I said that he's acting like a loser, and that feels kind of strong, because I don't know exactly what's happening. And I mean, if someone's getting aggressive, maybe sometimes you got to let them loose, but I don't know if that was the case. And so regardless, just you have to default that you are an NFL player, and that the fallout of doing that is worse than what that person is doing right now. And so I just think
Yeah.
Rashee Rice is he's moved himself downhill when we were very bullish previous to that car accident that he got into.
Yeah, man. I think, look, just don't put yourself in certain situations as you're going through certain things, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you've got this eye on you, and you do right now, like maybe going out and being in front of the media is not the best thing. Like, find some people around you that, care about you and want the best for you, and just focus on yourself. I think going out right now and trying to, still live that 22-year-old life is just something that's not in his best interest. But look, I hope he figures it out, because
Yeah.
he's been a great player for them, and, we'll see. But
Yeah.
um,
Get in
Trav,
there.
I'll finish off with my last couple here. Alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I think this basically spells the end for any sort of value for Miles Sanders, unless he gets traded to the Dallas Cowboys.
Yeah.
But also, Chuba Hubbard, right? I think Chuba, going back a couple months ago, was a really fun veteran buy that was good for contending teams, right? Like largely super cheap, and had decent production last year that you could use
Yeah.
in a pinch. But I just think that we've seen Canales go that bell cow route. It's probably not going to happen right away. We know that, but Chuba's in the last year of his rookie deal. I can't imagine that you draft Jonathan Brooks at 46 overall and really not have him be the focal point or the main piece of this going forward. So, look, if you can get any sort of value out of Chuba at this point, I would absolutely go do it. Otherwise, he's probably a guy that just becomes a roster clogger for you.
Yeah, totally. And just because I'm obliged to, I have to give Chuba a shout out because he's Canadian. And I'm not like, I will always have a candle burning for him, but I would love to see him go
Yeah.
somewhere that's going to give him a shot. But yeah, it's not going to be in Carolina for sure. So very well put, man. You got another? Or is that it?
That's it. I'm
That's a
good.
wrap, boy. All
That's a
right.
wrap.
Well, nice little epi. We came in under the 2 hour mark that we were at last week. And just for context, everybody, this is like the fifth time that Wiz and I have done this show together. So a little bit longer than we would want. But I think for me, like, I don't really sweat that too much, because if there's good conversation happening where we're talking some ball that can help you, I'm down to do so. So
Yeah.
really appreciate the support so far. The views, I'm pretty sure almost every episode you've seen an increase in the views. And now that we're on both of those audio platforms, we're seeing the numbers go up on there. So like, cannot thank everybody who's listened and watched enough, because we're a new podcast, right? And we're just getting started. And I personally think that we're doing some pretty good work. And so if you want to tell your friends, let some people know that there's a good new podcast out there, would love for you to do so. subscribe to that YouTube channel. That is one of the best ways to help us. But there's tons of other ways too. Go get that UN score. Remember, we're going to do a contest here. So make sure you're following us on Twitter, because tomorrow, Wednesday morning, when we drop this, there will be a tweet going out that tells you what you need to find as your Easter egg from in this episode in order to win a free copy of the UN score. We got merch happening, Wiz. We got best ball season happening. Remember that promo code UNDROPPABLES for a fat stack on top of your original fat stack that you deposit. So things are moving, man. And I'm feeling really good about where the brand is going. Loving the work that I'm doing within it. Love working with you on the pod, my brother, and love all the other stuff that you're doing as well. So any parting shots for the people or any thoughts you wanted to share before we ride out?
No, I think, one of the things that we've been doing, really focused on Dynasty these last couple of weeks. And I think the way to tie out the draft as far as that is some of those winners and losers post draft. One of the things that Trav and I were talking about last night is doing some of that best ball stuff, right? We've been kind of weaving it into some of our conversations here, but we're looking forward to doing some live drafts and talking through some picks and some strategies and stuff like that. So, look for maybe a couple change ups here as we get through some of the off season. But, I think this was a nice way to tie off some of the draft season, Trav. And just to kind of echo your points, if you guys have been checking out the podcast, we really, really appreciate it. We like putting it together for you guys and hope that you guys are finding some value from it. So much appreciated.
Yeah, 100%, man. It's been great. And just so everybody knows, you this week are headed off to jolly old England for some tea and crumpets.
Yeah, you sound like you're from London.
Yeah, well, I got a little bit of the blood. I've got some Welsh and some Scottish, maybe a little bit of English in there. Yeah, I like doing a good English accent. My kids love my Scottish accent. They think it's the funniest thing that they've ever heard. Yeah, they just howl. So fun stuff happening. But yeah, I will have Dynasty Joe on next week in your stead. So we're going to have a fun episode planned there. And yeah, we're always open to suggestions too. So if you've kind of got a flavor for the way that Wiz and I like to approach the game, and you think there's something cool that we could do that you would like to hear, you would like to see, fire off something in the comments, because we love that. If we can kind of directly bring some value to you with what you're looking for, we want to do so. So that's all we got for tonight. We really appreciate you sticking around. Appreciate you following the brand. Go check out everybody at the Undroppables. There's tons of good stuff going on, especially on that YouTube channel. But until next week, that is Wiz. I am Trav. Peace.